Okay, everyone, I think we will kick off the start now. Thank you all for just waiting for those extra couple of minutes, and hopefully a few more people will be able to join as we carry on with the event. So first off, I'd just like to welcome everybody to the Cafe Disability Hate Crime and Incidents webinar. This is the first webinar that myself have as hosted, so it's great to see so many people joining us today, and also really good to see so many familiar names joining, as well as so many new ones as well. We hope you will find the event informative. For those of you who don't know who I am Amy Wilson, and I'm Cafe's Fan Liaison and Access Officer. And today co-presenting with me is Cafe's Research Officer, Isabel Robbins. Thanks, Izzy. The main aim of this webinar is more or less a conversation starter. As part of our works, we've recently been interviewing disabled fans about their experiences and attitudes to reporting disability, hate crimes and incidences. So we want to use this webinar to encourage more disabled fans to talk about this very important topic, so we can help create strategies to prevent future cases happening. So a little brief overview for everybody of what the webinar will consist of. We will be looking at what a disability hate crime or disability hate incidents are, and what these can look like within a footballing environment. Often it seems fans and clubs are a little unsure around what constitutes a disability hate crime or incident, so we will look at that in much more detail. And the webinar will also discuss the Cafe reporting mechanism, which we will be launching early in 2021. This reporting tool will enable fans to make reports of incidences of disability hate crimes to Cafe to help us with our direct research into this topic, help us to generate more statistics around the prevalence of these cases within football, and also to help us support not only disabled fans, but their clubs to help resolve and hopefully overcome issues, ensuring that they do not happen anymore. It often, as you said, it often seems that fans and clubs alike are unaware of what constitutes a hate incident, and also that these events are often occurring within football environments, and therefore when cases are made known to their clubs, they're not often taken seriously. So just to give a bit of an example, a disability hate crime and incident refers to acts of physical or verbal abuse to a person in person or online. So this does not include cases of possible discrimination against disabled people, such as failure to provide a reasonable adjustment or a service or facility for a disabled person. So there is a complete distinction between the two types of case. So before I hand over to Isabel, who will be introducing our two panelists for today's event, I just want to go over some housekeeping rules with everybody, the boring side of webinars. The webinar will be recorded for training and quality purposes internally for Cafe. Some parts of the webinar, such as the panelists sections, will be made available to watch at a later date on Cafe's website. As attendees, you are automatically muted, but if you wish to ask a question in our dedicated question and answer session towards the end of this webinar, please click your raise hand button, which will either be on your panel at the bottom of your screen or in the participants list at the side, and if you just go on your name, it should be there somewhere. Alternatively, if you don't wish to speak and you do have some questions, if you could type those in the designated Q&A box, which is also on the bottom of the toolbar, as opposed to the chat box, all questions to go into the Q&A box, please, because that will make it a lot easier for myself and Izzy to keep track of what's coming in and what questions we can ask. If we're not able to answer all questions that we receive today due to the timings, we will put the questions to the relevant panelists and come back to you either later today or tomorrow with an answer for you, which we will send to you via your emails, which we have saved. So I'm just now going to pass you all over to Izzy for her to introduce our guests and to introduce, to also start with our first panelists session as well. So Izzy, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Amy, and thank you everyone so much for joining today. I'm Isabel, Cafe's Research Officer. We're really delighted to have two expert speakers joining us today. Dr Miro Griffiths, who's a disabled activist, academic and football fan, and then Pavel Klymenko, Head of Policy, Global Monitoring and Human Rights at FAIR. To start us off, we're joined by Dr Miro, who will be discussing the definition of disability, hate crime and incidents in a European context, and some of the issues with gathering data on hate crime more generally. Miro?
Thanks, Izzy. And thank you, Amy. I was having troubles listening to you, Izzy. I think as a few people in the audience as well have said that maybe the volume was a little bit low. So hopefully we can fix that later on. But hopefully people can hear me. So it's a pleasure to be here. As Izzy said, my name's Miro Griffiths. I'm based at the University of Leeds. And I have a background in working in, particularly around the issues of disability. My research is mainly based on activism and the role of disabled people's social movements in challenging marginalization. But I've also worked in areas of hate crime, not necessarily to do with the context of football, but obviously there are some crossovers here. So what I thought the most useful thing I can do is give people an introduction to thinking about hate crime and how we understand that. So I'm just going to bring up my slides, which I hopefully think people will be able to see. Can people see this? Yeah, okay. So if we, next slide. So the first thing I think which is helpful for this is to reflect on this concept of hate, which usually gets a lot of attention when we think about hate crime. Often we see people say, well, you know, how can you prove it's the premise of hate? And what hate is referring to here, I would say, is the level of seriousness and the importance and the urgency surrounding trying to address the criminal matter or the incident that's occurred. So it's not so much about this idea of hatred, but it's actually about this idea of hostility or prejudice towards a particular group. And if there's a criminal behavior, if there's a criminal act to this, then it's specifically seen as a criminal behavior motivated by hostility and prejudice, which means that hatred could be a part of that. But what we're most interested in is this targeting and victimizing of a minority group or a member of a minority group where there is prejudice or hatred towards that group or that individual. And that was the basis or the motivation for the incident. So the best way to think about this is that you have a perpetrator or you have a group of perpetrators. And in the context of disability, it's a targeting disabled person or disabled people because of their prejudice or hostility or bias or a hatred towards the identity of disability. And we can also think about this in terms of hate speech as well. And I think this is something that's particularly relevant to disability, where we've seen a lot of research that highlights how disabled people have been subjected to hate speech. And hate speech here is referring to using language or using speech to offend, exclude, intimidate, or discriminate against members of a particular group. So when we think about disability, we're thinking about those terms that are often employed, which are derogatory, which are used to subject disabled people to a form of violence, which is through verbal language. And I think this also has an incident for issues of disableism and the marginalization that disabled people experience, because it almost becomes commonplace. And a lot of people are often subjected to terms, and people like Leah Birch, a researcher, highlights this is often seen as kind of banter. There's a veil of banter that's used to say, well, I wasn't being serious, I was just having a laugh, I was just having a joke with somebody that the person doesn't know how to take a joke seriously. But what's underneath that is language that is trying to emphasize the inferiority of the disabled person and emphasize that the disabled person is subjected to the superiority of non-disabled people or people who identify as being non-disabled. But actually what we have here is speech that is being used to be extremely intrusive, that is being used to express hatred or intolerance or bias towards particular groups. And I think this is a common aspect of society, because if we think more broadly speaking, we're thinking about disabled people who are marginalized because of the unnecessary barriers imposed on disabled people. And the language that we use to think about that, the language that we use to describe disabled people, can often fall into the category of hate speech. I think this is something we may want to think about for the Q&A in particular. So try to explain this in terms of international definitions. I've drawn here from the Office of Security and Cooperation in Europe. And what we have here ultimately is the building together of a criminal offense, if we're thinking about hate crime. So a criminal offense plus this biased motivation, so this motivation towards disability or towards disabled people, and that results in what we refer to as a disability hate crime. So what's key here, if we think about people's experiences, or we think about trying to address this, there has to be this emphasis placed on the motivation of the incident or of the crime, and it has to be led by a prejudice towards disabled people or the concept of disability. And what we then have is that this prejudice manifests itself either in the selection of the target or in the expression of hostility. So the motivation to commit the crime was motivated on the basis of, it's a disabled person, so I'm going to attack this disabled person because I have a hostility towards the disabled people's community, or I think that my motivation to commit the crime is because the person is a disabled person. So it could be, I may want to attack this person because I think there's an easier chance of getting away with the crime because the person is disabled. So it's thinking about that motivation and then how that manifests into a particular crime. And what we have here on this slide is I've drawn out some data here from 2018, showing you some of the reporting levels within different countries. And what we have is, sorry, I don't know why my notifications are coming up. What we have is a number of different levels across different countries. So we have, for example, in Germany, 22, we report hate crimes, hate incidents or incidents of discrimination by police towards disabled people or on the concept of disability, all the way ranging to England and Wales of 5,558. Now, there are two camps of thought with this, and I think this is important when we think about strategies to address hate crime. On the one hand, we can think about the situation of, well, numbers are increasing because the situation is getting worse and more people are being subjected to hate crime. Or we could say that numbers are increasing because there are better and comprehensive systems of reporting and also having reassurance culturally of ensuring that groups and communities feel that they can come forward. Now, I'm pretty much leaning towards the latter argument. I think that the numbers where we see an increase is generally due to better reporting mechanisms. But we have to recognize also that still people have been placed in very precarious situations and things have got worse due to austerity and due to various implications of political and economic decisions. But you can see a real divergence of numbers here. And what I would suggest to people is when you're engaged in thinking about hate crime and challenging hate crime is to raise attention where the numbers are pretty low and ask those sort of questions of, well, what kind of mechanism do we have in place? And how do communities feel empowered or supported to come forward to report incidents of crime and incidents of hatred? And I won't go into this in too much detail, but this is a piece of research that I did, which I think was the reason why Izzy and Amy got in touch with me. And this was a survey that I did when I was based at the European Network on Independent Living, where we spoke to organizations about different aspects of hate crime So when we ask people to describe the types of work that they do on disability hate crime, you can see a range of different avenues that people may take, or organizations may take, ranging from trying to focus on improving law and legislation, all the way through to establishing dialogue between organizations to have more awareness and be more committed to addressing disability hate crime. And also in terms of third-party reporting mechanisms, which is a serious issue that needs attention, because for many communities, trust of going to the police is completely broken. And we need to think about how to offer alternative forms of accessible and inclusive ways of reporting hate crime. And when we asked people in part of the research to think about what they need to advance their work, there was issues of funding, but there's also issues of consistency, of trying to make sure that police, prosecutors, the criminal justice system were consistent in the way that they understood the seriousness of disability hate crime, of how to use existing law. And that raises an important point, because even though we're talking about disability hate crime very broadly speaking, different countries across Europe have different criminal codes. And sometimes, you know, the criminal code surrounding, say, the UK may be very different from another country in Europe. So you have inconsistencies of whether disability hate crime is even recognized within the criminal codes. When we asked people to think about examples of good examples to disseminate, there was emphasis placed on trying to promote third-party reporting mechanisms, but there was also issues around trying to promote disabled people's attention and understanding and awareness of hate crime. If the community themselves don't understand or are not exposed to information about hate crimes, disability hate crimes, then it's unlikely we'll see opportunities to have good reporting or people feeling comfortable coming forward about their experiences. And finally, this was in terms of going forward, there was points here about collaboration, of working with different groups, bringing different institutions together, as well as thinking about how to understand disability hate crime in more detail. And before I come to a close here, I'd just like to raise a couple of points, really. One is this issue of vulnerability. And I think there's a danger sometimes within the discussions around hate crime that we refer to assuming disabled people to be vulnerable. And I think this is toxic and problematic. One is that disabled people and disabled people's community have strived for many years to distance themselves from the notion of vulnerability. And if we return to the notion of vulnerability, i.e. we need to do something about disability hate crime because certain groups are vulnerable, then I think that creates more problems, and it returns us to traditional methods of addressing issues such as institutionalization, segregation, as a way to protect people. And actually what we want to recognize is that when disabled people are placed in vulnerable situations, it's due to the way that the social, political, economic arrangements that cause or exacerbate these issues. It's not inherently within the individual to be a vulnerable person. So finally, you know, to bring us to a close, I think there's two particular ways to think about addressing disability hate crime. One is to focus on the legal and mechanistic approach. And what I mean by that is by improving legislation, building upon things like the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities or Disabled People. It's also about thinking about how to create mechanisms of better information, better support for the criminal justice system to be aware of this, to improve third-party reporting mechanisms, and to ensure that disabled people's organizations are involved in collaborating with these institutions and with these mechanisms to improve reporting and action on this. But I think that's, if we limit ourselves just to the legal and mechanistic, I think we're in danger then of thinking about the broader situation of why this is happening. So we can think about disability hate crime in terms of just trying to solve it at the end point, i.e. responding to the prevalence of it, or we can think more broadly about why people are placed in these situations. And I think when we think, that requires us to think about how disabled people are seen as inferior or seen as an undesirable community within society. And that requires us to be a little bit more expansive in our thinking around the political and economic and cultural and social conditions that create this prevalence or this experience of disability hate crime. We've seen disabled people be treated as as burdens upon society. We've seen the language used around, why should we be supporting disabled people in times of crisis, such as austerity? If we don't tackle those broader systems of thought and those narratives, then I don't think we'll get to the crux of trying to address disability hate crime. So I know that was a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully it was informative and useful for getting a little bit of grounding on what disability hate crime is. And I will stop there, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Miro. And if anyone has any questions, please do put them in the Q&A box or wait until our Q&A session at the end. How's my sound? Is that working for everyone now? Okay, cool, thanks. So as we heard from Miro, there are quite a lot of difficulties with data collection in the wider context of disability hate crime and incidents, and this is no different in football. The most recent kind of European-wide research is from Cafe's Disabled Fan Survey in 2016, and this found that around a quarter of disabled fans across Europe had witnessed or experienced it. But the only country-specific research we have is from the UK from 2017 from the charity Scope, and that found that around 40% of disabled fans had experienced negative attitudes from other fans at matches, and around 29% had been subject to verbal disability abuse. So it's clearly an issue within football, but we do need more data to kind of back it up, which is something we'll come on to a bit later. In terms of what these incidences look like within football, we know from our discussions with disabled fans and comments that have been made in previous surveys that many of these do involve verbal abuse and harassment. A lot of this is things like mimicking and mocking how certain disabled fans might celebrate a goal, or abusing disabled fans for moving slowly around stadiums using disability slurs. And as well as kind of mocking disabled people directly, as Miro discussed, when slurs and certain language is used to target players or to criticise officials' decisions using disability terminology, these football matches really can become hostile environments for disabled fans. And on top of these kind of types of reports, we've also heard about more physical attacks, including a high-profile case where disabled fans were pelted with bottles and spat at by opposition supporters, which Pavel, our speaker from FAIR, will come back to in his talk later. We're now going to hear from Amy, who is Cafe staff member and also a disabled fan that travels to matches across Europe, about her personal experience of an incident like this. So, Amy.
Thanks, Izzy. Just difficulties on muting there, sorry. Yeah, unfortunately, or fortunately maybe, I have only really ever encountered something that I would class as a disability hate crime or an incident of hate crime once in my years of going to football matches, which I first started attending matches in 1993. So but this experience has stuck with me since then, to be honest, and it was quite consuming and affected me in ways that I actually really didn't think about. But basically, the situation was I attended a game as an away supporter, but due to the layout of the stadium, there was no accessible facilities in the designated away section, so all away disabled fans had to sit in the home ends. And while sitting there, myself and the rest of the disabled supporters who attended that game and their companions suffered a series of verbal abuse from a small number, it has to be said it was a small number, of home fans who were in the seat below where the accessible viewing area was. It all really started when we celebrated a really good save that the goalkeeper had made, and comments then started to come to us about how we, as away supporters, should not be sat in these spaces, how we should be sat in the away end, even though we kept saying that it was not our fault, we had no choice but to sit here, this didn't make any difference. And the comments were then coming back, well, if it's not suitable for you to be here, you shouldn't be allowed to come, things like that. And it was a continual rhetoric of you are not allowed to be here. You should not be here. The comments continued from practically kick-off to most of the first half, to be honest. The comments then increased in the tone, and a lot of the comments then came about, most of these probably aren't disabled, they're just after free tickets or cheap tickets, which is quite hurtful to hear people thinking that of disabled people. It got to the point before half-time where I wanted to leave the match. The comments were hurtful, they were upset, and they were continual, and it was really hard to keep yourself in that environment. Then it got to the point where my team scored. Actually, we scored twice, and I didn't celebrate, which, if anyone knows me from going to the match, that's not me at all. Celebrating is what I do. I literally did not move. I sat still. I forced myself not to move because I was fearful of further comments being made. Some of the other disabled supporters who were there did celebrate and were then asked to leave the stadium by stewards because more comments were received from the supporters in front because they were celebrating. I have said I've never ever felt like that at a match before, and I really genuinely did not want to go back to that stadium. One of my friends convinced me to go back the following season, and I have been back on a couple of occasions since, but I really don't like going to that stadium because I am so fearful of comments being made and similar emotions being encountered because of the location of the accessible facilities and the fans below not being open and welcoming to having away supporters sat so close to them. As this was the first real example of a incident of hate crime that I'd encountered before, I really didn't know what I was supposed to do in reporting this about it. People were telling me to report it, but I didn't know the correct, or even if there was a correct way of going about it. So I wrote to both my club and the opposition club, as did other disabled supporters who were there on that day, and no one heard back from either club about that, which to me was extremely disappointing, as it kind of made us feel like what had happened to us that day wasn't of any importance. Sort of made it feel like, well, if you choose to go to that game and knowing full well that you're not going to be in the away end, it's part and parcel of being an away supporter at that stadium, and you just have to accept what will happen or potentially could happen to you, which again made the whole situation just even more upsetting and made me quite angry, to be honest.
Thank you, Amy, for sharing that. And I'm sure your experiences probably do resonate with a lot of the fans listening, especially those forced to sit away from their own fans at stadiums. We've heard a lot of reports of these kind of similar events happening either in the stands or when moving around to get to concessions. Your story also really demonstrates the negative impact that these incidents can have on disabled people's ability to enjoy the game in the same way as other fans. In our fans interviews, we found that many fans had decided not to go back to grounds where they'd experienced abuse or felt increasingly anxious about going back to matches. The survey I mentioned earlier from Scope found that 62% of fans wouldn't return to watch live matches after these kind of experiences. And we also heard from a couple of fans who had given up their season tickets entirely, some of whom had been because they'd experienced abuse multiple times from their own fans, and clubs had asked them to change their season ticket location rather than address the problem that it was the fans in the surrounding area. And basically for them, that meant that rather than a match being something to look forward to, it was a source of stress and anxiety and what's going to happen this time. We also heard from fans who said that witnessing the abuse of other disabled fans can have a massive impact. There's been quite a few high-profile cases of videos of disabled fans being shared around Twitter, and fans said that that made them feel very anxious about returning to matches because you've seen videos of disabled fans being mocked and abused online. Will this happen to me? So in order to create interventions to tackle this behaviour and to kind of reduce this really negative impact on fans, we do really need to gather more data that represents disabled fans across Europe and looking at the individual situation in specific countries. So the first stage of this is to open up an accessible reporting feature on our cafe website, which will open in the new year. We really, really want fans to use this form, and we'd like to hear about your past experiences of any kind of incidents like these within football. And then once we've returned to matches, and if any of these things do happen, please do share them with us. So by sharing these experiences, you can help us learn more about the kind of incidents that are happening, the impact this is having, and what we can do to prevent them. In addition to this, you can also use the reporting feature to request support from CAFE if an incident does happen, and we can help you contact clubs and national associations and help facilitate discussions between fans and clubs. And we've got Pavel here from FAIR today, and he's gonna tell us a little bit more about the incident I mentioned earlier and how footballing authorities have acted in support of disabled fans when incidents like this have happened in the past.
Thank you very much, Izzy, and thank you for having me here. As I've been introduced, I'm Pavel and I'm working for the FAIR Network. We're a network of NGOs, fan groups, human rights organizations working throughout Europe and globally to tackle discrimination, all forms of discrimination in football, and using football as a tool for social inclusion. So we've been, for the past 20 years, we've been trying to tackle discrimination in football and have been working very closely with CAFE especially on disability abuse, and basically taking their guidance on on any cases that arise. In 2013, we have developed what we call an observer system, where we, in cooperation with UEFA, we analyze the international matches in the UEFA Champions League, Europa League, and national team matches into the likelihood of discriminatory abuse based on several criteria, including past incidents, the number of traveling fans, presence of active hate groups among the supporters, and other factors. And identifying high-risk matches, we send our trained observers to record the evidence of discrimination if it happens. And this evidence is then passed on to the UEFA disciplinary body that is conducting an investigation and is able to apply disciplinary sanctions towards the clubs whose fans engage in discriminatory behavior. Our reporting has always included all forms of discrimination, including disability abuse. But as Izzy, Amy, and Dr. Miro Griffiths already said, the data and the reporting of disability abuse is very, very low. It is very, I would say, one of the most underreported forms of discrimination currently in football, because for a long time, discriminatory abuse against disabled people have been framed, or are rather issues faced by disabled supporters in football have been framed in terms of barriers and in terms of accessibility. And the side of the issue where recognizing that disabled people and disabled fans, particularly in the stadium, are facing very similar experiences as many other minorities inside the football stadium are facing. Of course, they're facing additional barriers, but in essence, in terms of abuse, they are also receiving discriminatory abuse. This is clear, and this is something that's a conversation that should have happened a long time ago. So I think we're on the right way into raising these issues and recognizing finally that this is something that has to be given way more attention. To give you an example of how we work with UEFA to report discriminatory abuse, I will mention the incident. So already in the second year of our observer system operation, we had an incident that came up in the Champions League match between Paris Saint-Germain and Chelsea that was played in Paris in 2014. And we received reports from disabled fans with the help of CAFE, who have flagged the abuse that's discriminatory abuse that they received. So the disabled fans section in the Paris Saint-Germain stadium at that time was in the central stand in front of the home fans, where the visiting disabled fans were, had to be seated. So they couldn't be seated. There was no facility, basically no possibility for them to be seated with their own away fans. So they had to be seated in the central stand. And what they experienced was very much what's similar to what Emmy described. It was verbal abuse. It was throwing of objects. It was a lot of things. So with the help of CAFE, we gathered witness statements and addressed UEFA, although there was no video evidence available, which is most of the case what disciplinary bodies, the UEFA disciplinary, would need to prosecute the case if it's not mentioned in the official match report, which I believe at the time it wasn't. So it was the reports and witness statements by disabled fans, Chelsea disabled fans who received the abuse. So we raised the issue with the UEFA disciplinary. They've conducted an investigation and issued what I believe was for the first time in history, a sanction against the club for discriminatory abuse of disabled people. They've ordered partial stadium closure for Paris Saint-Germain for one next match, which is the minimal sanction for the first offense according to the UEFA disciplinary regulations at that time, and they've ordered them a monetary fine. Obviously, Paris Saint-Germain appealed the sanction, and on appeal, UEFA have adjusted the sanction, ordering them, so introducing, an element to avoid similar situations in the future. So they've ordered Paris Saint-Germain to organize, to provide the possibility for visiting disabled fans to be seated with their disabled fans. But from the one hand, it's an improvement of a sanction, there's no question. But from the other hand, by doing so, the issue has again, went into the issue of accessibility. The disabled Chelsea fans have not been abused because they were seated in the wrong place. It was not because of them. It was because of the Paris Saint-Germain fans who directed discriminatory abuse. And it's important to recognize that people can be hateful against disabled people. We've seen it, many examples that easy, and Dr. Griffiths already mentioned. We've seen it a number of times, using discriminatory slurs, disability slurs, to target people, for their appearance. We know probably one of the most widely known examples is Lionel Messi, who have been quite often targeted with disability slurs throughout his career. And we need to recognize that this is the abuse, discriminatory abuse, that is very similar to what many minorities in many stadiums across Europe and worldwide are facing, and treat it as such and apply all the mechanisms that exist to tackle it, that are available in the disciplinary regulations. So not just to say that it's an issue of infrastructure or issue of barriers. We need to recognize that people are targeting disabled people with discriminatory abuse. Thank you very much at this point, and I'm happy to answer any questions that would arise.
Thank you, Pavel. If anyone does have questions to direct to Pavel, or also, as Izzy said earlier, to Dr. Griffiths, please put them in the Q&A box below, or wait until the end of the session, and we will be able to come to you and ask for your questions then. It was really powerful to hear from Pavel then about the positive and permanent changes that have been made at a club to enable disabled supporters to sit with their own fans. However, it is really important that clubs don't just react to these incidents in terms of improving accessible infrastructure, but work proactively to prevent them from occurring in the first place. And I think that is a point that Pavel really made, and it's hit home quite well. So what other mechanisms can clubs do to help in these cases? Clubs should train their staff and matchday stewards to recognise disability, hate crimes and incidences. They should help them to be able to respond to reports received during matches and also after matches, and support us to respond appropriately and also respectfully to fans who report any incidences directly to them. So that may be a case of knowing a steward knowing who to take it to, who are above them, like a senior steward or a member of the club's disability liaison team if they have one, so that the some official recognition is given to that complaint. Clubs should also ensure that any reporting mechanisms that they offer to fans who experience any incidences of hate crime at a stadium are accessible for use by differently disabled people. This may include offering disabled people an opportunity to report any incidences via telephone to the club's DAO or other member of staff, or that they can speak with their disabled supporters associations if there is one at their club, who will then be able to raise the case on behalf of them to the club and be the intermediary person, as it were. Other services could be an email service, a text service, anything that will help disabled people feel comfortable in reporting cases. Clubs must also acknowledge and respond to all reports received by fans in an appropriate way. For example, we have heard in our research with disabled fans examples of disabled fans being asked to move when they've reported some cases of abuse to stewards, instead of the people who have been making those comments being asked to move. In addition, the situation that I spoke about earlier, where neither of the clubs who were involved on that day responded to not only my emails about the day, but also other disabled fans' correspondence were totally basically ignored by the clubs, is unacceptable, and clubs should be proactive in responding to any cases and treating them with the respect that they deserve, and undertaking of communication and dialogue to help disabled supporters feel reassured that they are being taken seriously.
And then in terms of what clubs can be doing now proactively, we know that there's a belief that hate crimes happen because the people who commit them feel threatened by the perceived differences of the minority group. That's come from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And in that case, they're threatened by the differences of disabled people. And we can see this actually in Amy's example, where non-disabled fans were accusing disabled fans of lying to get cheaper tickets. So one of the things clubs can do is tackle this by raising awareness of the reasons why disabled people might be entitled to what's seen as or perceived advantages, such as complimentary companion tickets or priority access for concession queues or security lines. Clubs can also challenge these attitudes by ensuring the way that the clubs represent disabled people is positive and empowering, and it doesn't reflect the charity model on your social media pages and through club foundations as well. And although it can seem a little bit trivial, focusing on language is actually a really good way to make a difference. As Miro said, the use of offensive language in relation to disability is highly prevalent, and within football this is a massive issue, especially online, but also in the stands, where slurs are used to criticise referees and players and to insult the opposition, as Pavel mentioned. And even though this language might not necessarily be actively directed at disabled people, it really creates an unwelcoming atmosphere. And one of the key things we think is important to challenge here is how players discuss and use disability terminology. We know that players are role models for millions and can have a massive influence on their fans. Yet there are many, many cases of players using derogatory disability terminology, and that normalizes it as acceptable language. We think it's really important that clubs are educating their players on inclusive language, and to support clubs with this, we will be publishing guidance on appropriate disability terminology, which explains which terms to avoid and why they're offensive. And we really encourage clubs to use this to educate their players and staff, and also their non-disabled fans, to help educate people on this terminology and to stop normalising the use of these slurs. As Miro also discussed, institutional changes are really necessary, and we really think that increasing the representation of disabled people in key roles in clubs is also essential to tackling this issue with the perceived difference between disabled and non-disabled people. Clubs have to emphasise the rightful place of disabled people within football, whether that's in management roles or as spectators. And here, your actions can really speak louder than words. Disabled people should not be seated in segregated spectator areas or asked to use segregated facilities. They should be positioned within and across all areas of the stadium. As we've seen in Amy's story and in Pavel's example, positioning disabled away fans in home sections can lead to abuse and harassment.
As also mentioned in the discussions earlier, incidents of disability hate crime are often underreported. So therefore, it may appear to the governing bodies in football, national associations and clubs that disabled fans are not actually experiencing any kind of hostility when they're attending matches. Whereas CAFE research has shown that approximately a quarter of match-going disabled fans have either experienced cases themselves or witnessed cases against other disabled people. To make footballing authorities better understand the cases that are happening when it comes to disabled hate crime, the regularity of these incidences and the impact that these can have on disabled people, CAFE would really welcome receiving past experiences of hate incidences encountered by disabled fans to help us build up a detailed statistical evidence on the types of incidents, the frequency of those incidences, where these incidences occur, and any outcomes that were reached. To do this, we are inviting any disabled fans who are part of today's call or Disabled Supporters Association representatives to share their experiences with us. To do this, you can contact myself and Isabel via email. Our contact details were in the webinar agenda which you all should have received prior to this event yesterday, or alternatively, you can telephone the CAFE office on +44 0208 065 5108. Any information can be shared with us anonymously, and it will really help us to increase our knowledge and understanding of this important topic, and will also help us to spread this message to clubs, national associations and leagues. We will also be reaching out to disabled fans and disabled supporters associations in the coming weeks to ask for some help in the testing of our reporting tool before its official launch next year. We are looking to receive detailed user-led feedback from the target audience of this tool for information on its user-friendliness and also any improvements that you feel would help to make the tool even more suitable and something that disabled people would feel comfortable in using to report incidences of hate crimes. So now we are going to open up the floor to questions. Mindful of time, because we know Pavel needs to leave to join another call soon. So if we do not get a chance to answer your question, in this section, we will reply to you later on. But we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. So the first one is Is it the case that incidences of disability hate crime are not always reported because disabled people don't feel the comments made to them are actually examples of a hate incident? Do we need to educate on this for both disabled people and non-disabled people? And can football be used as a vehicle for that education? Miro, would you like to answer that question?
I can do, yeah, I can start. So I think it is the case, because what we have, particularly for disabled people, is this feeling of what we refer to as internalized oppression. So people experience marginalization and discrimination, but they think, well, it's because of who I am, so it's justifiable, and therefore I will accept it. And this comes obviously from the constant pressures of marginalization and discriminatory actions by various individuals, from organizations, states, down to communities and groups of perpetrators. So there's a question of how to support disabled people to recognize when they are experiencing something that is unjust, that they do have a mechanism to report that, whether that's to the police in the first instance, and then if it's not a criminal matter, then it can be passed to relevant authorities. So there's an issue there as well. But I think there's also a key point here about what I refer to as kind of the bureaucratic or administrative response. So sometimes what we find is that, and this, again, I'm not talking about this in the football context, but if you think about it in terms of institutions or day centers or residential homes, what you find is that there'll be a perpetrator in that environment, in that situation. And when it's raised as a incident of possible hate crime or hate incident, the response is then to address it within the parameters of the administration. So it becomes, you know, a discussion between line managers and the staff member or the customer. It becomes a situation that is dealt in-house, and it doesn't get raised to the point where police then or outside bodies are involved. So we also need to recognize that when there are incidences of possible hate crime, that we deal with it in the first instance within that environment, i.e. through stewards, through the football club itself, but we also take it to as a possible criminal matter that needs to be investigated. And finally, I think, yes, you know, what can football be used as a vehicle? Yes, and I think that goes back to Isabel's point about the role of the football club as a community, as part of the community, and thinking about how we position disability within the narrative of the football's engagement in the community. We don't want this to be overtly medicalized. We don't want this to be overtly rooted in tragedy and charity. We want to see disability as an issue of social justice being picked up by players and by clubs and by supporters in the community and much broader in the country as well.
Cheers, thank you for that detailed answer, Miro. And we have another question. First of all, the question starts with thank you to all the presenters. And then the actual question is, given the instances of abuse and hate in football that have been experienced or referred to in this session, do you think the COVID-19 pandemic will have an impact on people's attitudes to disabled people? Again, Miro, if you'd like to take the lead.
I can take it, yeah, I'm happy to. Obviously, I'm conscious I answered first and last question.
No, it's fine.
So I saw that Paul Kitchens asked this question, who's a good friend of mine and a respected scholar in sport and disability. I think it is, there will be an impact, and I think this comes to a broader thing about how disabled people are categorized as either deserving support or not deserving support, and the fluctuation that has between spectators and indeed responses by organizations and administrations. So you see it's a real precarious situation where sometimes disabled people are recognized as they need support and they should have support, and then there are other environments that they find themselves in where they are told they shouldn't have access to that, or their grievance is unjustified. And I think the coronavirus impact will exacerbate that issue of deserving and undeserving. And I think there's also a concern by, as we move out of the pandemic and we have economic crises affecting many countries across Europe, usually what we see in these times of crisis, such as austerity or periods of kind of humanitarian crisis, is that disabled people are often left behind and not supported, or they are exposed to extreme forms of violence and intolerance because people are frustrated with their own living conditions and they look for communities to blame. So I think COVID will exacerbate it, and I think that we'll see that within football environments as well as we'll see it outside of football environments as well. So it's something that we need to be mindful of and think about how can we put mechanisms in place now to mitigate that. And I think that goes back to the first question about how do we build trust within football clubs and within disabled people's communities to be in a position to respond and action this.
Izzy, have you got anything to say on this?
Yeah, sorry, I can't raise my hand as a co-host. So I think in two ways people's attitudes will changing. There's definitely some increased empathy, but I think we need to make sure that within football we're not contributing to this idea that all disabled people are vulnerable and extremely clinically vulnerable to COVID. And so that means making sure that when players do return to stadiums, disabled spectators are able to return as well, and that any provisions in place, such as mask exemptions in certain countries, are communicated appropriately to fans that are attending stadiums, so that fans who might be exempt from wearing a face covering as a result of some medical condition are not then abused by other fans. So I think people's attitudes have changed, and we just need to keep ensuring that football is not going to contribute to any further abuse by not communicating clearly that face coverings and social distancing measures might be slightly different for disabled people.
Totally agree. Education and communication, as always, are the key points in anything that involves disabled fans. We have a live question now, so hopefully this will work. Daniel, hopefully you'll be able to ask your question. You may need to take yourself off mute.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, but brilliant. Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, my question is, what do you see as the biggest barriers to reporting at the moment?
Ooh. Anyone on the panel like to go for that one?
Well, I can maybe try. Well, as with many other underreported forms of discrimination, you know, it's several elements together. The lack of reporting mechanisms that are, you know, trusted and reliable, and I think Café is now trying to address that, and it's very, very welcome. And the second element is the lack of awareness, indeed, of how to recognize and how to report. And the third element is as well trust. Trust that when you report an incident, it will be taken seriously, there will be due process that is transparent, and then there will be an outcome that will be transparently communicated. I think to me, these are the three elements that are most important.
Yeah, I agree there, Pavel. Going from my experience and the lack of trust that I probably do now have with reporting after what has happened, I'm not entirely sure that if I was placed in a similar situation again in football or in another social event such as concerts or something, I am not entirely sure that I would actually report it for fear of it just making me feel again it's just something that you should accept. So yeah, I definitely think trust is a huge part of why people don't always report cases. So I think that is all the questions that we have at the moment. I can't see anybody else with their hands up or with questions in the Q&A. Thank you, Daniel, for that question. It was really
no problem. Thank you, guys. Thank you, team. It's been good.
Thank you. So I'll just give a double check that there is a panelist with their hand up. Mira, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, just to add on to Pavel's point, really. I think the best way to approach this is to think about it in terms of a macro, micro, and meso level. So at the macro level, we need to have more conversations and more action around improving legislation and improving people's understanding of the legislation. And then at a meso level, there's an issue around culturally, how do we ensure that first responders such as police are taking this seriously? We've got cases and examples of police not really enthusiastic about handling the response, see it more as a community problem that they leave to the community to address. So I think at the meso level, there's something about how to improve dialogue and collaboration. And I think what ultimately needs to happen is a collaborative mechanism where you have disabled people organizations alongside footballing groups and footballing institutions like FAIR and so on, who are then working with national and regional police and criminal prosecution teams, so that there can be a strategic activity around what do we do when this happens and how do we respond to it, and that will build a trust.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that answer as well, Miro. I think that is pretty much it for this session. We've managed to keep to time pretty well as well, which is quite an achievement. So we will be able to allow Pavel to join his next call. I'd just like to say on behalf of Isabel and myself, as well as the whole of the Cafe team, we'd like to thank everyone who has attended today's online webinar. We hope that you found the session informative and that it's been an education as well, and it will be a conversation starter within your Disabled Supporters Association, within your NGO, within your club on this topic. We please to this is to any disabled fans and DSA representatives who are part of the call. Please do share the details of any incidences you've experienced or witnessed in the past, as this information is so crucial to Cafe going forward to help ensure that our guidance documents and the reporting tool will be the most accurate and reflective of disabled fans and their experiences, and will ultimately help to benefit everybody and hopefully help to reduce the number of incidences that there are within the footballing world. We'd like to pass on our sincere thanks to both Dr Miro Griffiths and to Pavel Klymenko for being panelists today and sharing their expertise on this subject of disability hate crime. Thank you to both. Just a little side note, Cafe will be hosting further online webinars starting in 2021 in January on topics such as the Cafe Week of Action, social model of disability, and the importance of match day feedback. So please look out for further announcements on Cafe websites and also our social media channels ahead of our next event. And if it is at all possible for you to join in, please do so. We would love to have your involvement. And finally, we would just like to wish everyone a safe and healthy festive period, and we hope to see as many of you as possible in person in 2021. Thank you again for joining, and wishing you a lovely rest of your Wednesday evening. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.